The musket balls whistled through Spanish moss like angry hornets, tearing leaves from ancient oaks as 400 enslaved souls marched toward their promised land. Behind them, smoke columns rose from 3 burning plantations, the flames painting the Louisiana sky the color of revolution. This isn't just another forgotten footnote in American history. It's the story of the largest slave uprising the United States had ever seen, one that nearly changed the course of a nation. On January 8, 1811, before dawn broke over the German coast parishes north of New Orleans, Charles Deslondes made a choice that would echo through generations. The mixed-race driver on the Andry plantation had spent months whispering in slave quarters, building networks, stockpiling makeshift weapons. The cane harvest was done. The masters were comfortable. It was time. The night air hung thick with river fog and the scent of wood smoke from hearth fires when Deslondes struck his first blow, not with a musket or blade, but with an axe meant for splitting kindling. Manuel Andry, the plantation owner, barely escaped with his life, fleeing half-dressed into the darkness as rebels seized his armory. His son wasn't so fortunate. From the New Orleans Gazette, January 11th, 1811, the insurrection commenced at the plantation of Mr. Andry. The Negroes proceeded to arm themselves with such weapons as they could find. Within hours, the rebellion had its weapons, its leader, and its terrible momentum. Deslondes understood what his contemporaries in Haiti had proven just years before, that enslaved people, properly organized and sufficiently desperate, could topple any system built on their backs. The rebels moved like wildfire along River Road, plantation by plantation, freeing the enslaved and adding them to their growing army. But here's what the history books often miss. This wasn't random violence born of desperation. This was war, calculated and strategic. Deslondes had studied the Haitian Revolution. He knew that Toussaint Louverture had defeated Napoleon's armies with formerly enslaved soldiers. He believed the same could happen here. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten revolution, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you're finding this story as incredible as I am, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting started. The rebels didn't just free slaves. They recruited them into military formations. They seized horses, donned their masters' clothing, and some even carried flags. Though what those banners looked like, history doesn't record. What we do know is that plantation houses burned behind them like beacons, each one a signal to other enslaved communities that the impossible was happening. By midday, nearly 500 people marched in formation toward New Orleans, drums beating, voices raised in songs that mixed African rhythms with Creole French. Imagine standing on your front porch that morning, watching the horizon fill with smoke, hearing those drums growing louder. The rebellion had legs, but as Deslondes' army grew larger and more confident, word raced ahead of them toward the territorial capital. Governor William Claiborne was about to receive news that would terrify him more than any foreign invasion. His own enslaved population was coming for him, armed and organized, with New Orleans just 30 miles away. What happens when an unstoppable force meets the full military might of a slave-owning society that cannot afford to lose? The church bells of New Orleans clanged in frantic discord as riders thundered through the French Quarter, their horses lathered with sweat and their voices hoarse from shouting the unthinkable. The cobblestones echoed with boots as militia members scrambled from taverns and coffee houses, still clutching their morning café au lait. Governor Claiborne faced every slaveholder's deepest nightmare, a coordinated uprising that could inspire copycat revolts across the entire South. The messenger who reached Claiborne that Tuesday morning painted a picture that chilled the territorial government to its core. The rebels weren't a disorganized mob. They moved with military precision. Deslondes had divided his forces into companies, appointed lieutenants, and established a clear chain of command. Some carried captured muskets from plantation armories, Others wielded sugarcane knives that could decapitate a man with a single swing. The sound of gunpowder and war drums drifted across the Mississippi River like thunder from a distant storm. Plantation bells rang continuously, not calling workers to labor, but sounding the alarm that the entire racial order of Louisiana hung in the balance. From Claiborne's correspondence, January 9th, 1811, I have this moment received information that an insurrection of a serious nature has broken out. Within hours, Claiborne had mobilized every available military unit, regular Army troops from Fort St. Charles, territorial militia, and hastily assembled volunteer companies of armed citizens. He also dispatched urgent messages to plantation owners downriver, warning them to fortify their properties and arm their overseers. But here's what makes this rebellion truly extraordinary. The enslaved people of Louisiana had been planning this for months, possibly years. Archaeological evidence from plantation sites suggests that makeshift weapons had been cached throughout the German coast parishes. Secret meetings had taken place in slave quarters, using the cover of religious gatherings and work songs to coordinate their uprising. The fear was contagious. White families along River Road abandoned their plantations entirely, loading carriages with silver and family portraits, fleeing toward the safety of New Orleans' fortified walls. Some masters attempted to rally the remaining enslaved workers, offering promises of freedom and protection. Most found their quarters empty. Their human property had vanished into the cypress swamps or joined the growing rebel army. By nightfall on January 8th, the rebellion controlled nearly 30 miles of the most valuable agricultural land in North America. Sugar plantations worth millions in today's currency lay in ashes. The rebels had demonstrated something that terrified the South more than any foreign invasion, that enslaved people could organize, fight, and win. Contemporary accounts describe plantation wives clutching their children, staring out shuttered windows at the orange glow on the horizon. Overseers who had built their careers on violence suddenly found themselves outnumbered 50 to 1, their whips useless against organized resistance. What would you have done that night, watching smoke rise from your neighbor's property, knowing that the people you had enslaved for profit were coming for you next? The rebellion had crossed its first major test. It had momentum, territory, and the element of surprise. But Deslondes and his followers were about to discover that revolution demands more than righteous anger and stolen weapons. They were about to face the full military might of a nation that could not afford to let them succeed. Muddy boots thundered across the wooden planks of the Deslondes plantation as Major Milton's federal troops took position behind cotton bales, their muskets gleaming in the January sun. The sweet smell of molasses from burned sugar mills mixed with the metallic tang of fear as nearly 1,000 government soldiers prepared to crush the largest slave uprising in American history. Deslondes had led his people into a trap, and everyone on both sides knew that only one army would march away from this confrontation. The military response was overwhelming and immediate. Governor Claiborne had mobilized regular army units, territorial militia, and volunteer companies of armed planters. General Wade Hampton dispatched additional federal troops from Baton Rouge. Naval vessels moved up the Mississippi to prevent any escape by water. The rebels found themselves surrounded by a professional military force that outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. Military records from January 10th show the methodical planning behind the government response. Artillery pieces were positioned to command the river road. Cavalry units patrolled the cypress swamps to prevent retreat. Supply lines were established to sustain a prolonged campaign if necessary. The United States military was treating this not as a police action, but as a war. What the rebels couldn't have anticipated was the speed of the federal response. Within 36 hours of the uprising's start, Major Milton had assembled a combined force of over 800 professional soldiers, armed planters, and militia volunteers. They moved with the efficiency of troops who understood that failure meant the potential collapse of slavery throughout the South. The reckoning had come. The battle began at dawn on January 11th near the Deslondes Plantation, approximately 20 miles upriver from New Orleans. Contemporary accounts describe the rebels as well-formed and determined, fighting with captured muskets, sugarcane knives, and farm tools converted into weapons of war. But military discipline can only take you so far when you're armed with machetes facing professional soldiers with artillery support. The rebels fought with the desperate courage of people who knew that surrender meant death regardless. Deslondes led from the front, wielding a captured officer's sword as he rallied his forces against repeated cavalry charges. For nearly 2 hours, the outcome remained uncertain, as the rebels used their knowledge of local terrain to mount fierce resistance. From Major Milton's official report, the brigands were posted in a wood in rear of a plantation. They were completely routed, though they fought with desperate valor. The turning point came when federal artillery began shelling the rebels' position in the woods behind the plantation. The enslaved fighters had no answer for cannon fire. Their lines broke under the bombardment, and what had been an organized military formation dissolved into scattered groups of desperate individuals seeking escape in the swamps. Charles Deslondes fell during the final cavalry charge, his body riddled with saber wounds. With their leader dead and their formation shattered, the rebellion that had terrorized white Louisiana for 3 days collapsed in a matter of hours. But the killing had just begun. What followed the battle was not military justice, but systematic terrorism designed to ensure that no enslaved person would ever again dare to dream of freedom through organized resistance. How do you send a message that will echo through generations when mere defeat isn't enough? Severed heads lined the river road like grotesque mile markers, each one mounted on a pike and positioned to stare down at anyone who dared travel between the German coast and New Orleans. The January wind carried the stench of decay mixed with the smoke from still smoldering plantation houses, creating an atmosphere of calculated horror that would haunt Louisiana for generations. This wasn't justice. It was psychological warfare designed to ensure that the very idea of slave rebellion would die with the rebels themselves. The systematic executions began immediately after the battle. Military tribunals were convened not to determine guilt or innocence, but to identify ringleaders and decide which deaths would send the strongest message. Court records from January 12th show that most proceedings lasted less than 10 minutes per defendant. The verdicts were predetermined. Major Milton and Governor Claiborne understood that defeating the rebellion was only half the battle. The other half was ensuring that no enslaved person in Louisiana would ever again believe that organized resistance could succeed. They needed theater as much as they needed violence. The executions were public spectacles designed for maximum psychological impact. Plantation owners brought their remaining enslaved workers to witness the consequences of rebellion. Children were forced to watch as their fathers and brothers faced firing squads. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you forget your place. From a contemporary witness account, the heads were cut off and stuck on poles along the coast as a terrible example to all who should see them. But here's what makes the aftermath particularly chilling. The authorities didn't just execute the rebels. They displayed their remains as permanent monuments to white supremacy. The heads were positioned at specific intervals along River Road, creating a corridor of terror that every traveler had to navigate. Charles Deslondes received special treatment. His body was burned, his ashes scattered, and his head placed on the tallest pike at the Deslondes Plantation, where the final battle had occurred. The authorities wanted to eliminate any possibility that his grave could become a shrine for future rebels. Terror has its own geography. The psychological impact extended far beyond Louisiana. News of the rebellion and its brutal suppression spread throughout the slaveholding South, carried by newspapers, letters, and word of mouth. Plantation owners from Virginia to Texas tightened their control systems, increased patrols, and implemented harsher punishments for any signs of resistance. What's remarkable is how effectively the government propaganda machine worked to minimize the rebellion's significance while maximizing fear of its consequences. Newspaper accounts describe the rebels as brigands and murderers rather than organized military forces, yet simultaneously emphasize the massive federal response required to defeat them. Local residents were encouraged to view the executions not as acts of state terrorism, but as necessary measures to protect civilization itself. The narrative was carefully crafted. The rebels were savage criminals who had threatened innocent families, and the government's response was both proportional and merciful. Contemporary letters reveal that many white Louisianans found the displays of severed heads disturbing, but few dared voice their objections publicly. The heads served a dual purpose, terrorizing the enslaved population while reminding white citizens of the violence that maintained their privileged position. The rebellion had been crushed, its leaders executed, and its memory distorted by official propaganda. But the authorities had overlooked one crucial factor. Stories have a way of surviving, even when storytellers don't. What happens when you try to bury a revolution, but the ground refuses to keep it down? Whispered songs drifted through slave quarters on moonless nights, carrying coded verses about a man named Charles who had dared to dream of freedom and died fighting for it. The melodies wound their way through cotton fields and rice plantations, spreading from Louisiana to Georgia to the Carolinas, carrying a message that no amount of government propaganda could silence. The rebellion's true legacy wasn't written in official records or newspaper accounts. It lived in the collective memory of enslaved communities who refused to let their heroes be forgotten. Within months of the executions, a remarkable transformation occurred. The stories of Charles Deslondes and his followers began evolving, growing larger and more heroic with each telling. Slave narratives collected decades later reveal how the rebellion became a foundational myth for resistance movements throughout the antebellum South. The oral tradition preserved details that official histories deliberately omitted. Enslaved storytellers remembered that the rebels had maintained military discipline, that they had shown mercy to captured enemies, and that they had fought with courage that impressed even their executioners. These weren't the savage criminals described in white newspapers. They were freedom fighters who had briefly created their own liberated territory. Contemporary plantation records show a pattern of increased security measures throughout the South following the Louisiana Uprising. Slave patrols were expanded, weapons were confiscated more aggressively, and plantation owners implemented stricter controls on slave movement and assembly. The authorities clearly understood that the rebellion's influence extended far beyond Louisiana's borders. From a Virginia planter's diary, March 1811. The late insurrection in Louisiana has awakened fears among our people. We have doubled the watch and forbidden all Negro assemblies. But here's what makes the rebellion's cultural impact so significant. It provided a template for future resistance movements. The stories emphasized strategic planning, military organization, and the possibility of sustained armed resistance. They showed enslaved people throughout the South that revolution wasn't just a distant dream, it was a practical possibility. Underground networks carried these stories across state lines, plantation boundaries, and racial divisions. Free people of color, sympathetic whites, and traveling enslaved workers all played roles in spreading the rebellion's legend. Each telling added new details, new heroes, new lessons about the tactics and strategies that had allowed the rebels to control Louisiana for 3 days. Revolution becomes, myth becomes inspiration. The rebellion also influenced white Southern culture in ways that historians are still uncovering. Plantation novels of the 1830s and 40s repeatedly feature anxiety about slave uprisings, suggesting that the Louisiana Rebellion had fundamentally altered how white Southerners understood their relationship with enslaved people. What's particularly remarkable is how the rebellion's memory survived the Civil War and Reconstruction. Oral histories collected in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration include dozens of references to the Louisiana Uprising and Charles Deslondes' War. Former slaves spoke of these events as foundational moments that proved resistance was possible. The story served multiple functions within enslaved communities. They provided inspiration for future rebels, tactical knowledge for escape attempts, and psychological strength for daily survival under bondage. They also created a shared identity among enslaved people across the South, a sense that they were part of a larger struggle for freedom that transcended individual plantations or regions. Modern archaeological work at rebellion sites has uncovered evidence that supports many details preserved in oral tradition, but absent from official records. Hidden caches of weapons, modified farm tools, and communication networks all suggest that the rebellion was far more sophisticated than authorities admitted. The government had won the battle and controlled the official narrative, but they had lost the war for historical memory. How do you destroy an idea whose time has already come? Steam rose from printing presses in Boston and Philadelphia as abolitionists seized upon the Louisiana Uprising, transforming Charles Deslondes from a forgotten rebel into a martyr whose story would fuel the growing movement to end slavery. The acrid smell of ink, mixed with the metallic taste of revolution as newspapers across the North carried detailed accounts of the rebellion that Southern authorities had tried desperately to suppress. The rebellion had become something far more dangerous than a local uprising. It had become proof that enslaved people could organize, fight, and nearly succeed in overthrowing the entire plantation system. Northern abolitionists understood immediately that the Louisiana Rebellion represented a watershed moment in American history. Here was evidence that enslaved people possessed the intelligence, courage, and organizational capacity to mount sophisticated military campaigns. The racist mythology that justified slavery, that enslaved people were passive, childlike, and incapable of complex thought, crumbled in the face of Deslondes' three-day revolution. William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator published extensive coverage of the rebellion beginning in 1831, 20 years after the events. Garrison understood that the story served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the inherent violence of slavery, proved that enslaved people would fight for freedom when given the opportunity, and provided tactical knowledge for future resistance movements. The rebellion's influence on other slave revolts was immediate and measurable. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia showed clear organizational similarities to Deslondes' uprising military formations, coordinated attacks on multiple targets, and systematic destruction of the plantation infrastructure. Turner had almost certainly heard stories of the Louisiana Rebellion through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across the South, from Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative. I have often been asked how I felt when first I found myself on free soil. I felt like one who had escaped a den of hungry lions. But here's what makes the rebellion's long-term impact so profound. It fundamentally altered how both enslaved people and abolitionists understood the possibilities for resistance. Previous slave revolts had been portrayed as spontaneous outbursts of violence. The Louisiana Uprising proved that enslaved people could plan, organize, and execute complex military operations. Ideas have their own momentum. The rebellion also influenced the development of the Underground Railroad. The networks that spread stories of Deslondes' uprising became the foundation for the communication systems that guided escaped slaves to freedom. Conductors like Harriet Tubman carried tactical knowledge that traced directly back to the lessons learned in Louisiana. Southern authorities recognized the threat and responded accordingly. New laws restricted slave movement, prohibited enslaved people from learning to read, and increased penalties for anyone caught assisting resistance movements. The rebellion had forced the entire South to acknowledge that their system of control was more fragile than they had imagined. International observers also took notice. British abolitionists used accounts of the Louisiana Uprising to support their arguments for ending slavery throughout the British Empire. The rebellion became part of a global conversation about human rights, freedom, and the moral bankruptcy of slavery as an institution. What's remarkable is how the rebellion's memory persisted even as official histories tried to erase it. Local Louisiana traditions preserved stories that contradicted government accounts, describing Deslondes as a skilled leader rather than a savage criminal. These alternative narratives survived in Creole communities, free black households, and sympathetic white families who understood the rebellion's true significance. The Civil War finally provided the context that allowed the rebellion's full story to emerge. Union officers investigating Southern military preparations discovered documents that revealed the sophisticated nature of Deslondes' organization. Suddenly, the savage uprising described in Southern newspapers was revealed as a carefully planned military campaign that had nearly succeeded. Charles Deslondes had been dead for 50 years, but his revolution was just beginning to change the world. What happens when a story becomes too powerful for any government to contain? School children in modern Louisiana walk past historical markers that mention the German Coast Uprising in sanitized language, but they never learn that Charles Deslondes nearly toppled the entire plantation system with nothing more than courage, organization, and an unshakable belief that freedom was worth dying for. The morning air still carries the weight of untold stories as tour buses roll past the very plantations where revolution once bloomed and withered in the span of 3 January days. This rebellion didn't just challenge slavery. It proved that every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction, waiting for the right moment and the right leader to bring them to life. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 became the template for every subsequent freedom movement in American history. The organizational tactics that Deslondes developed, decentralized leadership, coordinated communication networks, systematic targeting of infrastructure, would reappear during Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and every struggle for justice that followed. Modern historians have uncovered evidence that the rebellion was far more sophisticated than authorities admitted. Archaeological excavations at plantation sites have revealed hidden weapon caches, modified farm tools, and communication networks that stretched across multiple parishes. The rebels had been planning for months, possibly years, building the infrastructure necessary for sustained resistance. What makes the rebellion's legacy so powerful is how it demonstrated that oppressed people don't need permission to be free. They only need organization, courage, and the willingness to act when the moment arrives. Deslondes proved that revolution isn't about having superior weapons or numbers. It's about understanding that no system of control can survive when the controlled refuse to participate. The rebellion also revealed the fundamental weakness of slavery as an economic system. For 3 days, the most productive agricultural region in North America ground to a complete halt. Sugar mills stopped turning, cotton remained unpicked, and commercial shipping ceased entirely. The rebels had demonstrated that the entire Southern economy depended on the voluntary cooperation of enslaved people, cooperation that could be withdrawn at any time. From a modern civil rights organizer, every movement for justice stands on the shoulders of those who came before. Charles Deslondes taught us that freedom isn't given, it's taken. Contemporary social movements continue to study the rebellion's tactics and strategies, the way Deslondes built coalitions across plantation boundaries, maintained discipline under extreme pressure, and created alternative power structures during the uprising, provides a blueprint for modern organizers fighting different battles for justice and equality. The fire still burns. What's remarkable is how the rebellion's memory has survived nearly 2 centuries of attempts to erase or distort it. Each generation has rediscovered Charles Deslondes and found new relevance in his story. During the Civil Rights Movement, activists compared their struggle to the German Coast Uprising. During the anti-apartheid movement, organizers studied Deslondes' tactical innovations. The rebellion forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about resistance, violence, and the price of freedom. Deslondes and his followers chose armed revolution over gradual reform, organized violence over passive resistance. They understood that some systems of oppression are too entrenched to be dismantled through negotiation or moral persuasion. Their three-day revolution failed militarily, but succeeded in ways they could never have imagined. They proved that enslaved people could organize, fight, and govern themselves. They demonstrated that the plantation system's control was an illusion maintained through violence and propaganda. Most importantly, they showed future generations that revolution was possible, that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary power and nearly win. Charles Deslondes died on January 11, 1811. But his revolution continues wherever people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Every successful freedom movement carries DNA from that three-day uprising when enslaved people in Louisiana proved that the impossible was just another word for difficult. The German Coast Uprising remains one of the most suppressed stories in American history, but suppression and silence have never been able to kill an idea whose time has come. Some say that on foggy January mornings along the Old River Road, you can still hear the sound of drums and marching feet, as if Charles Deslondes' army is still out there somewhere, still fighting for the freedom that was always theirs by right. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.